Yeah. In his 2016 essay collection, How Will Capitalism End?, Wolfgang Streeck gives an unambiguous answer to the leading question of the ontology, Does Capitalism Have a Future?, which was jointly written by Immanuel Wallerstein, Randall Collins, Michael Mann, Georgi Delugoyan, and Craig Calhoun. According to Streeck, capitalism entered its final stage with the eruption of the world financial crisis in 2008. The only open question now, he claims, is what course this end stage will take. In the ontology, Does Capitalism Have a Future?, Mann and Calhoun challenge Wallerstein and Collins' thesis that the breakdown of the capitalist system is imminent. Informed by the analysis of Wallerstein, Collins, and Streeck, I want to argue in the following: that the prevailing form of capitalism in the Western world over the last centuries, which had gained a global influence through colonialism, has now fallen into a final systemic crisis. Hence, Mann and Calhoun's assumption that the existing form of capitalism can be tempered and thereby rescued by the welfare state is unconvincing. While Wallerstein focuses on Western capitalism's now exhausted compulsion to global expansion, Collins investigates the potential for conflict in capitalist countries resulting from the erosion of the middle classes through the job losses occasioned by digitalization. Streeck builds on Collins' analysis in How Will Capitalism End? He discusses capitalism's colonial or neo-colonial compulsion towards expansion in German zwischen Globalismus und Demokratie. So, globalismus is a typical German term. I don't know whether there is an English equivalent. Globalism, does that exist? Globalism? Yeah? Okay. And democracy. The remarks that follow are divided into three parts. First, I outline the antagonism between the Staatsvolk and the Marktvolk. So these German terms are also presented in German in the English translation of Streeck's book, Buying Time, The Delayed Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. So Marktvolk means people of the market, and then the translation of Staatsvolk is, in this English version, general citizenry. So literal translation is people of the state, people of the market, people of the state, but in this English translation, the German terms are still used. So that is the basic antagonism, according to Streeck, in present capitalism, between Staatsvolk and Marktvolk in democratic capitalism. Here, Streeck draws on Jürgen Habermas and Klaus Offer's theories of capitalist system crisis from the 1970s. I then explain Wallerstein, Collins, and Streeck's accounts of the causes and impacts of the world financial crisis that erupted in 2008. In the concluding part of my lecture, I relate Streeck's view of the war in Ukraine to Josef Vogel's in German Kapital und Ressentiment, published in 2021. As far as I know, this book has not yet been translated into English, as far as I know. Streeck has, in my opinion correctly, seen the outbreak of the war as confirming his prognosis in How Will Capitalism End, namely that capitalism will move into an interregnum in the sense that Antonio Gramsci uses the term. Gramsci understands this as a state in which the old is dying, but the new cannot yet be born. Such a stage gives birth to monstrosities, as Streeck puts it. Vogel makes a more concrete prediction at the end of Kapital und Ressentiment. The current configuration of capitalism could provide, quote Vogel, the ferment of the new pre-war period, end of quote. Vogel's diagnosis of a progressive erosion of social coherence in capitalist countries, which he sees as providing the ferment of a new pre-war period, supports Streeck's prognosis that capitalism faces a long period of systemic disintegration. In contrast to Streeck, however, Vogel assumes that Western capitalism, quote, will not be destroyed by its contradictions, but will instead turn to profitable ways out and new procedures for the creation of values, end of quote. In my opinion, Vogel, like Mann and Calhoun, overestimates the resilience of the prevailing form of capitalism in its current crisis. Now, the antagonism between Staatsvolk and Marktvolk in Streeck's analysis and its connection with Habermas and Offe. In How Will Capitalism End, Streeck writes that, quote, contemporary capitalism is vanishing on its own, collapsing from internal contradictions, end of quote. To use Streeck's term, the central contradiction in bourgeois capitalist form of society emerges between the moral economy of democratic capitalist society and the economic economy of the capitalist economy. Streeck's contrast between these two economies can be concretized using his conceptual pair Staatsvolk-Marktvolk. According to Streeck, the capitalist bourgeois state is the addressee and mandatory of two differently constituted collective types, and at the same time, quote, the intermediary system between two conflicting environments. While these function in accordance with logics that are largely incompatible with each other, government policy must, as far as possible, satisfy them at the same time. The Staatsvolk, the general citizenry, and what I refer to as Marktvolk, the people of the market, end of quote. Streeck's conceptual pair, Staatsvolk-Marktvolk, thus combines a system-theoretical perspective in which the social subregions are discussed as subsystems that have their own specific environments, with an action-theoretical perspective in which social groups are considered as collectives, types, that are co-responsible for their actions. Streeck intertwines this dual methodological perspective with a substantive opposition between civic democratic and capitalist logic. The paradigmatic protagonist of the capitalist market logic is the Homo economicus, who pursues his own interests and only has to comply with agreed contracts. On the other hand, civic democratic logic ensures democratic decisions are acceptable to all participants in that the principle of majority decision is combined with the protection of minorities through the guarantee of human rights. The bourgeois conception of human rights that was coined by John Locke has the character of a possessive individualism. It recognizes everyone's ownership of their own person, including their own labor power and property, and thus everyone's right to pursue their own interests within a legal order that also grants this right to all other citizens. The moral economy of capitalist society consists in this. Streeck takes up the Frankfurt theories of crisis from the late 1960s and the early 1970s with the thesis that the double dualism of his conceptual pair, Staatsvolk-Marktvolk, constitutes a methodological instrument for explaining crisis of the capitalist system as well as for uncovering possible ways out. Adorno already saw Jürgen Habermas' pioneering contribution to the Frankfurt theoretical tradition in his insight that a methodologically reflective socialist theory that is academically up to date, but also removed from a naive positivism, must link a system theoretical perspective with an action theoretical perspective. In his 1973 Legitimation Problems in Late Capitalism, Habermas acquires a theoretical instrument for analyzing the then imminent stagflation crisis by intertwining this methodological dualism under the heading, as in his late writings, of the conceptual pair system-life world, with the substantive dualism of the mechanisms of the capitalist market and democratic norms. The stagflation crisis consisted in economic stagflation with high inflation rates at the same time. The system aspects discusses the control mechanisms of a society. The life world aspect discusses normative structures under the life world aspect. The controlling capacities of systems or subsystems are aimed at securing their borders and thus their continued existence by defending against dangers from the environment, from which it also extracts its resources. The normative structures of social life worlds keep a society from slipping into a war of all against all. Habermas traces social system crisis back to the fact that contrary system imperatives corrode the normative structures of the life world to such an extent that the respective society is destabilized. The first 3 decades after the Second World War saw the establishment of a, to quote Streeck, capitalist peace formula. It consisted of a Keynesian-influenced economic policy that sought to secure the population's purchasing power. This economic policy was motivated by the insight that the mass unemployment created by the world economic crisis that erupted in 1928 was one of the main causes of the National Socialist seizure of power and hence of the Second World War. The Keynesian economic policy of the post-war period was based on an interventionist state committed to disciplining the market for planning and redistribution. State investment programs and generous social benefits were supposed to prevent mass unemployment, to guarantee the population's purchasing power, and so to stimulate economic growth. Maintaining continual economic growth is a core concern of the market economy. Adam Smith claims its autonomous dynamics can balance out the opposed interests of businesses and wage earners in times of prosperity. The increased need for labor power enable wage earners to push through wage increases in accordance with the law of supply and demand. Their consumption possibilities grow, which also benefits producers and providers as the demand for goods and services increases. In the post-war democratic capitalism constrained by the welfare state, the contradictory system imperatives of the growth-oriented capitalist market and the welfare state, which sought to use tax revenue to secure social stability by taking measures against unemployment and poverty, were in equilibrium for 3 decades. The Keynesian peace formula ran up against its limits with the persistent growth crisis of the 1970s. The attempt to maintain it through expansive fiscal measures and monetary policy sent the rates of inflation soaring while economic growth stagnated and the gains in prosperity threatened to disappear. Western countries were no longer able to extract enough financial resources from the market economy through taxing incomes and levies on profits to fulfill their declared aim of guaranteeing the purchasing power of the socially disadvantaged. Western countries' adherence to this plan up to the end of the 1970s led to enduring crisis for the contemporary tax-financed welfare states. They faced the accusation that they were destroying the public finances with their generous social benefits, and they would, in the long term, bring about precisely the enduring unemployment and mass poverty that they had made their declared aim to combat. The adherence to the welfare state model revealed, so that was the accusation, a clientelist politics that damaged the common good. Habermas took up Klaus Offer's concept of the capitalist state in legitimation problems with late capitalism by applying Offer's guiding thesis that a capitalist system crisis arose from contradictory system imperatives. According to Offer, the capitalist state, on the one hand, is materially reliant on the market economy. On the other hand, the definitions of the common good that it invokes to avoid jeopardizing the population's loyalty are a counter-image to the market struggle. That's an expression of Max Weber, market struggle. Like Habermas, Offer too works with the developmental dynamic category of antagonisms. Both authors conceive the dynamics of social crisis as a dialectical process in the sense that contradictory system imperatives and directions of action would sooner or later put the existing social formation to the test, delegitimating and destabilizing it. Since the capitalist state extracts the financial resources for the fulfillment of its overall social tasks from the market economy, it undermines the basis of its own legitimacy if it strangles the capitalist growth dynamic. The stagflation crisis thus pulled the rug from under the national tax-based state as a political formation. The crisis theories of late capitalism, conceived in the 1970s by Habermas and Offer, acquired a self-reflexive structure through the intertwining of the substantive antagonism of the logic of the market and the democratic state with a methodological dualism between the system theoretical perspective and an actual theoretical perspective with a normative feature. By showing that the empirically ascertainable delegitimation of the existing social formation stemmed from conflicting system imperatives that had gotten out of equilibrium and that thus were the expression of a deep-seated systemic crisis, they wanted to contribute to transforming the prevailing conditions, a change whose extent can only be sounded out on the practical level. Habermas and Offer thereby draw on Max Horkheimer's conception of a critical social theory as a unity of theory and practice. In his essay, Traditional Critical Theory, published in 1937, which became of fundamental significance to the Frankfurt theoretical tradition, Horkheimer emphasized that social theoretical descriptions and explanations of social phenomena can affect the objects of their investigation by influencing the self-understanding and motivations of those whom it addresses. A critical social theory that is aware of its possible influence on its addressees sees its core task as setting out alternatives, with concrete indications as to how they can be realized to what presently exists. As the title of his book, Legitimation Problems in Late Capitalism, already indicates, in 1973 Habermas had thought it possible that the symptoms of the capitalist crisis would impel a self-transformation of capitalism, and this could be driven on by political impulses. In the structural problems of the capitalist state, Offer ascribed a self-negating character to the contradictory developmental tendencies and saw this as providing a chance for overcoming the capitalist formation. Now, the next topic is the causes and impacts of the 2008 world financial crisis. Since the end of the 1970s, the supply-side economic policy recommended by Anglo-Saxon neoliberalism increasingly replaced the Keynesian management of demand. The relocation of productive capacities to low-wage countries stabilized consumption costs. State budgets were supposed to be restructured through cuts to social services and public investment programs, as well as through the proceeds of privatizations. Western countries succeeded in clearly sinking the rate of inflation through a neoliberal reorientation in economic policy. However, neoliberalism could not keep its promise that the social hardships that it brought about would not last, as the world economic weight had shifted in the course of the globalization it had spurred on. The relocation of productive capacities to low-wage countries and the establishment of a global free trade led to enduring economic growth that far surpassed that of the West in those previously developing countries. This eroded the global economic power that the West acquired through colonialism. Neoliberalism's haphazard dismantling of the neocolonial structures of the world economy contributed essentially to providing its promise of helping Western countries to enduring prosperity to be an illusion. The capitalism of modernity was, as Wollaston emphasized, a hierarchical global market economy in which the leading protagonists were able to make large and secure profits through their advantageous position in the geographical center. Wallerstein gives a system function explanation of capitalism's compulsion to colonial expansion. Since free competition in an established market economy lets business profits shrink, significant profits could only be achieved through quasi-monopoly on technical innovation. The colonial powers attained such a quasi-monopoly by violently opening up the traditional economic space for their industrial products. Since Western capitalism's power to expand globally has since become exhausted, its final systemic crisis is, according to Wallerstein, unavoidable. This is Wallerstein's claim. Streeck discusses the stagflation crisis of the capitalism reliant on expansion in his Zwischen Globalismus und Demokratie under the guiding concept of imperial statehood. He applies this to the neo-colonial structures of the global economy after the formal dissolution of the colonial empire. Collins too sees the core of the final systemic crisis in capitalist production's reliance on technological innovation, but from a different perspective to Wallerstein. As the need for human labor power is continually declining, and not just in production, but also in the service sector because of digitalization. Collins expects a drastic rise in unemployment over the next 2 or 3 decades. This will lead to a collapse of demand that cannot be absorbed by the economy, but only by massive state intervention. Collins traces the fact that such a demand crisis, which Marx and Engels had already predicted back in the 1940s, has not yet materialized back to the diminishing need for human labor power in production, as the consequences of its mechanization were compensated for by the creation of jobs in administration and the service sector. However, this will not be possible in the future, at least within the framework of capitalism, because of progress in information technology. Like Collins, Streeck too expects that the shrinking of demand as a result of growing unemployment will disrupt capitalism. He agrees with Colin Crouch that the loosening of credit in neoliberalism that led to the 2008 world financial crisis was motivated by a stubborn crisis in demand in capitalist countries, and this could not be remedied by shifting to supply-side economic policy. The reduction in credit checks when granting loans was supposed to strengthen the population's purchasing power and to keep economic growth on course. However, the world financial crisis revealed that the swelling of the quantity of money in circulation through credit had left the real rate of economic growth far behind and produced speculative bubbles. Government rescue packages for banks and large corporations in the world financial crisis drove the level of national debt into unprecedented heights. Even before the world financial crisis, the neoliberal turn in Western economic policy already drove up government debt. Hence Streeck's talk of the neoliberal debt state. Its, quote, subsistence depends not only on the financial contributions of its citizens, but to a significant degree on the confidence of creditors, end of quote. In How Will Capitalism End?, Streeck approvingly cites Larry Summers, who was the finance minister under Bill Clinton and himself had recommended the deregulation of the financial markets. Summers' diagnosis was that in the meanwhile, a secular stagnation had become entrenched that could not be managed through monetary policy. Streeck sees this as confirming the Marxist thesis that capitalism is inevitably headed for demand crisis that threatens the system. As in Habermas and Office crisis theories of late capitalism of the early 1970s, Streeck's analysis of neoliberal financial capitalism self-reflexively intertwines the methodological dualism of system and action theoretical perspectives with a substantive dualism between capitalists' market logic and civic democratic logic. From the system theoretical perspective, Streeck identifies the neoliberal debt state as the intermediary system standing between the conflicting environments of the globalized capitalist markets and the democratic electorate. The debt state is subject to opposed system imperatives. On the one hand, it must offer attractive investment conditions to globally operative capital and maintain the confidence of the financial markets through reliable debt servicing. On the other hand, it must not gamble away the loyalty of the voters. For if it seems to be the servant of capitalist interests, it must reckon with the citizens withdrawing their loyalty and turning to parties or charismatic leaders that promise to assert the national interest using authoritarian means. In the worst case, social unrest threatens. In the perspective of the action theoretical, or as Habermas puts, of the life world, the antagonisms between the logic of the Marktvolk and the democratic citizenry openly emerges. Streeck tries the fact that the neoliberal debt state subjects itself and its activity to the control of creditors shaped as markets back to the interaction of the aforementioned system imperatives with political decisions whose initiators can be made responsible for their actions. A democratic state can claim legitimacy in the eyes of its citizens only if its creditors are willing to finance and refinance its debt on conditions that are tolerable. Otherwise, there is a danger of economic collapse and its attending unpredictable social and political consequences. However, the debt state does not need to prioritize capitalist interests to the extent that it actually does. the possibility of debt relief remains fundamentally open to it. To avert this, and at the same time to prevent the depreciation of credit through high rates of inflation, creditors try to exert influence on government policy. The success of their endeavors is apparent in the legally codified obligation of Western central banks to secure price stability and the constitutionally required debt ceiling that is supposed to ensure reliable debt servicing. So as to avoid gambling away the population's loyalty, the political elites must present these fundamental political decisions as not allowing any alternatives. Streeck judges this to be an ideological failure of democracy. Misleading the voters damages democratic consensus building and supports an oligarchic neo-feudalism. The sustained endeavors of Western banks since the world financial crisis to boost investment through injections of self-printed money and to ensure the refinancing of state debt did not cure the stubborn weak growth of the real economy. The reduction of the debt mountain that was already there in Western countries and that had really piled up since the world financial crisis looks increasingly unlikely. The inability of the prevailing capitalism to fulfill its promise of prosperity for all becomes apparent in the growing social inequality in and the neglect of public infrastructure by the neoliberal debt states. The antagonisms between capitalist market logic and civic democratic logic becomes precarious in the post-democratically configured, increasingly dysfunctional financial capitalism. In the long term, the neoliberal debt state cannot do right by either the economic imperatives to stimulate growth, by setting a solid financial policy and warding off economic slumps, nor by the political imperative to conserve the population's loyalty to their formerly democratic institutions. Hence, Streeck takes the progressive delegitimation of the existing capitalist form of society to be inevitable. Because of the flagging growth in capitalist countries' real economy and the simultaneous exacerbation of social inequality, that political elites only take action against half-heartedly, if at all, the contradiction between the moral logic of the capitalist society and the economic logic of the capitalist economy is becoming so acute that, as Streeck rightly states, there is the danger of the far-reaching social disintegration and an interregnum in Gramsci's sense. The key role of economic growth in the self-understanding of the capitalist economy corresponds to the hope for upward mobility through the acquisition of useful qualifications in the moral economy of capitalist society. This trust is slowly diminished in the face of secular stagnation and the exacerbation of social inequality in capitalist countries. A widespread consequence of the loss of hope in the future is, as Streeck put it, an opportunism of collectively incapacitated, individualized individuals. In Capital und Ressentiment, Vogel focuses on another, still more powerful aspect of the current disintegration of capitalist societies. A resentful populism has become a social power factor because of the material losses in the aftermath of the world financial crisis and the fear in widespread of the Western population of a lasting social decline. They attack those whom they blame for the now endemic crisis with violent and cliched phrases. Minorities such as migrants and homosexuals or representatives of the established like, to quote Vogel, European bureaucrats, greedy investors or conspirators of the financial industry. End of quote. Vogel sees this as the prevailing capitalism's ruse of resentful reason, for both of the post varieties of populism contribute to its very stabilization, even though the latter aims at the opposite, as they veil the structural causes of its dysfunctionality. Now quote Vogel, "Critique fermented in resentment suspects, and so seeks supposedly liable and concrete, palpable surrogates for the impact of abstract systemic processes." End of quote. Whoever blames networks of politicians and industry leaders for the symptoms of the present crisis ignores the systematic causes of secular stagnation in capitalist countries. Blaming minorities like migrants and homosexuals for the crisis is even more misguided. In Kapital und Ressentiment, Vogel traces the strengthening of political and social corrosive powers in contemporary financial capitalism back to globally effective movements of capital that unfold an idiocratic intensification of power relations. They reproduce themselves by conjuring up anti-democratically diverging, competing, conflicting particularities. Vogel claims that the recent radicalization and negative socialization, which refers particularities to each other, and thereby pursues a devising principle, accords with the fundamental conflicting structure of capitalism that has become more acute in the aftermath of the world financial crisis. Vogel stresses that all capitalist societies are structures in terms of resentment, as they can only partially deliver on their promise of participation. Capitalism justifies its claim to superiority over all other forms of the economy by maintaining that the lasting economic growth that it can establish will benefit society as a whole in the long term. However, because of conflictual and power structures imminent to capitalism, the promise of participation proves to be deceptive in the periods of economic stagnation and recession that are, as history shows, inevitable. Economic crisis generally hits wage earners and the unemployed harder than businesses. The discrepancy between the capitalist promise of participation and the class oppositions that always erupt anew gives rise to resentment, if the grievances are primarily traced back to the culpability of social groups or classes, and the systematic causes are thus misjudged or ignored. When wage earners see business greed as the chief motivation for the pursuit of profit maximization, they ignore the fact that accumulating private capital is indispensable in the capitalist growth economy, as it makes the means of investment available. Inversely, businesses who think that an exaggerated sense of entitlement leads wage earners defend against their loss of earnings and the dismantling of social services, lose sight of the fact that capitalist market mechanisms presuppose that Homo economicus pursues its interest and that lasting weakness in purchasing power of employees, the unemployed and pensioners is economically detrimental because a decline in demand compels a reduction in the supply of goods and services. Such resentment is unavoidable if it is not admitted that capitalism cannot consistently fulfill its promise of participation. In such a case, the protagonist's character defects are regarded as the main reason for systematically unavoidable conflicts and powers relations. Vogel cites the increased anti-Semitism during the foundational crisis in the 1970s and the world economic crisis of the interwar period, both of which were triggered by a stock exchange crash, as historical evidence that financial crises especially fire the potential for resentment in capitalism. While previous anti-Semitism with resentment combined the stereotypical hate figure of greedy Jewish high finance with a hackneyed image of the Jew as a foreigner, as something alien. Since 2008, financial capitalists and migrants have been the target of the opposed populist resentments. Both reinforce ideological self-deceptions. Whoever gives the entire blame to the financial oligarchy for the world financial crisis and its social consequences does not acknowledge that since the 1980s, the neoliberal, to quote Crouch, privatized Keynesianism was motivated by the stagflation crisis of the previous decade, and that this was endorsed by the voters. It is even more misguided to blame refugees and migrants for the stubborn symptoms of the economic and social crisis in the prevailing capitalism. Both populist accusations help the stabilization of the financial capitalist economic system, although the first aims at precisely the opposite, as they veil the structural causes of this system's dysfunctionality. Vogel attributes a crucial role to ideological self-deceptions in the Western world in explaining the fact that despite the world financial crisis, political and academic discussions about system alternatives to the prevailing capitalism has not yet found a resonance among the public. Vogel's exhibiting of the system's stabilizing effects of false consciousness contains an appeal to take action against the existing conditions. With his warning about the new pre-war period in Capital und Ressentiment, he, like Streeck, with a picture of the dangerous future interregnum, calls on his readers to resist the current developmental tendencies that could provoke a fatal social disintegration. By linking their factual analysis with a social critical appeal, both Vogel and Streeck want to raise awareness of the opposed developmental possibilities in contemporary capitalist society. Both writers agree that a well-founded social analysis that is capable of uncovering ideological deceptions and self-deceptions must account for the intertwining of system mechanisms with the possibilities of action open to responsible protagonists. But while Streeck assumes that the contradiction between the moral economy of democratic capitalism, democratic capitalist society, and the economic economy of the capitalist economy has now become evident and irreparable, and that the end of capitalism is imminent, Vogel thinks it is possible that capitalism can remain stable under these circumstances because of the potency of ideological illusion. Whether Vogel or Streeck's assessment of the power of false consciousness is accurate is an empirical question. The self-reflexive theoretical disposition of Streeck's analysis of contemporary financialized capitalism is expressed in the title of his book, How Will Capitalism End? The title question includes a thesis underscored by its subtitle, Essays on a Failing System. According to Streeck, it is no longer a question of whether capitalism will perish, but only how this will happen. The book challenges the reader to take a position on this thesis and on Streeck's description of the imminent agonies of capitalism. In How Will Capitalism End?, Streeck states that he expects that socialism or any other clearly defined social order will not overcome capitalism in the foreseeable future, but that it will persist for a long time in crisis-ridden interregnum in Antonio Gramsci's sense, that is, in a condition where the old is dying and the new cannot yet be born, and which will conjure up the most, to quote Streeck, the most diverse kinds of pathological phenomena. With the title, How Will Capitalism End?, Streeck gives us to understand that this question is in no way conclusively answered with the book's prognosis of a long infirmity for an irredeemably dysfunctional capitalism with no prospect of a new beginning for society. The prognosis could prove itself to be false. However, as any prediction of future social developments is laden with uncertainty, this does not need to be emphasized. The performative meaning of the title, How Will Capitalism End?, is revealed against the background of Streeck's Buying Time and his article, Whose Side We Are On. In Buying Time, he describes the utopia of a democracy without capitalism, at least without the capitalism that we know, as the only alternative to the present post-democratic financial capitalism. He at the same time emphasizes that it seems totally unrealistic today, as it requires overturning a historical trend that has been progressing for decades. That this so seems, however, does not mean it is in fact so. If Streeck was convinced that there was no chance of realizing it, his appeal to build institutions through which the markets can be brought back under the control of society would be senseless. He explains his appeal in the following way, quote, "But before something like that can really come onto the agenda, at the least there will have to be years of political mobilization and lasting disruption of the social order that is today taking shape before our eyes." End of quote. In his article, Whose Side We Are On, which was published 1 year after How Will Capitalism End?, he advocates a renewal of the socialist agenda. He is as cautious in assessing its prospects for success as he was in his appeal to overcome capitalism as we know it in Buying Time. In How Will Capitalism End?, he points out that there is no global socialist movement at present that can stand up to globalized capitalism. By nonetheless advocating a fundamental transformation of the prevailing capitalism, Streeck accords this goal the status of historical possibility that is worth venturing. The title question, How Will Capitalism End?, thus links the theoretical proposition that every prediction about social developments is falsifiable with an appeal to falsify the book's prognosis of a tortuous interregnum by building a better society. This performative sense for the question of the title gives a concise expression to the architectonic of Streeck's analysis of financial capitalism as a unity of theory and practice in Horkheimer's sense. Now the last and short part of my talk, the West's role in the Ukraine war as a symptom for the systemic crisis of capitalism. The war in Ukraine shows how right Vogel's warning in Capital and Ressentiment was, namely, that the radicalization of negative socialization in capitalist countries could provide the ferment of a new pre-war period. At the outset of the war, Streeck pointed out that the geopolitical struggle between the USA and China is its geopolitical background. In June 2021, NATO had declared China as among its strategic rivals. in March 2022, the German federal government presented its new national security strategy. It includes worldwide so-called stabilization operations of NATO. Does China really threaten to Germany's security to a degree that this would demand a military response? The threat is obviously not military. China attacking Germany with intercontinental missiles belongs to the realms of fantasy. Rather, the economic and global political rise of China threatens capitalist states because their resultant economic weakness can exacerbate their internal social conflicts to the point of violent escalations. The storming of the Capitol by Donald Trump's supporters in January 2021 shows that this is a realistic scenario. NATO justifies its change from a defensive military alliance to a global intervention power by saying that it wants to protect freedom, human rights and democracy worldwide. Yet Western countries violate themselves the so-called rule-based international order that they supposedly want to protect. To give just two examples, the President of the United States, Joe Biden, confiscated the foreign assets of the central bank to the tune of $3.5 billion. Here's a mistake in the paper. It's $1 billion, not million, $1 billion. So as to distribute them among the American victims of 9/11. And this in a situation where the majority of Afghan population are starving. Amnesty International and a team of international journalists have documented that in Greece, Croatia, Latvia, and on the Polish-Belarusian borders, in recent years, numerous refugees have been prevented from applying for asylum through deportations that violate human rights and the use of torture and ill treatment. The erosion of Western positions of power in the Middle East, in Central and South Asia, and in France-Afrique shows that the West cannot compensate for the loss of its neocolonial global dominance by military means. The drastic rise in inflation and its accompanying exacerbation of social inequality in Western countries restricts the government's scope for action to such an extent that colludes hopes of restructuring over-indebted state budgets is just as unrealistic as man's plea for a return to the Keynesian economic policy of the post-war period. The massive looming distributive struggle will, in my opinion, also thwart the ruse of resentful reason in Vogel's sense. Yet Kalun and Men raise an important question which finds no answer in Wolfgang Streeck. Even if the current form of Western capitalism is doomed to collapse, does that mean an end to capitalism as such? Could not a different, presumably authoritarian form of state capitalism assert itself? If this is a realistic scenario, then we as democratic citizens in the West are faced with the task of preventing the destruction of democracy in the current interregnum. Thank you for your attention.